Are you ready for a spine-chilling tale that will keep you up all night? Look no further than Midnight Murmurs, where we bring you the best of the best in horror and mystery fiction. Join us on our channel as we explore the dark and twisted corners of the human psyche, where secrets and lies fester like a disease. In our latest feature, The Reaper's Hand, a small town is plagued by a vengeful spirit seeking revenge for the town's dark past. Watch as the town's sheriff unravels the web of secrets and lies, and uncovers the killer's true identity. But be warned, this is not for the faint of heart. Like and subscribe to our channel, and get ready to be kept on the edge of your seat with Midnight Murmurs. The Reaper's Hand. Chapter 1: The First Victim. The sun had just begun to rise over the small town of Millfield as the birds started to sing their morning song. But the peace of the morning was shattered by a blood-curdling scream that pierced through the air. It came from the woods, near the edge of town. The townsfolk gathered in front of the woods, trying to find the source of the scream. Their search led them to a gruesome sight. Lying in a clearing, amidst the bushes and the tall grass, was the body of a young woman. Her throat had been slashed and her body was covered in blood. The townsfolk stood there in shock and horror as they looked at the body. The silence was broken by the sound of sirens as the police arrived at the scene. The sheriff, a man with a weathered face and haunted eyes, stepped out of the car and made his way towards the crowd. He pushed his way through the crowd and stopped in front of the body. He looked at the girl's face, which was twisted in a look of terror and pain, and his heart sank. He had seen too many bodies in his time, but this one was different. As the sheriff examined the body, he noticed a symbol carved into the girl's flesh, a reaper's hand. He had seen this symbol before, but only in old folklore books. He knew that this murder was not the work of any ordinary human. It was something far more sinister. The sheriff knew that he had a difficult task ahead of him. He had to find the killer before it was too late. He had to stop the Reaper's Hand. Chapter 2: The Sheriff's Investigation begins. The day began like any other for Sheriff Tom Harding. He woke up early, had his coffee, and put on his badge before heading into work. But as soon as he walked through the doors of the station, he could tell that something was different. There was a palpable tension in the air, and everyone was on edge. It wasn't until he received the call about the murder that he realized why. He arrived at the scene of the crime to find the victim lying on the ground, blood pooling around them. It was a gruesome sight, but the sheriff had seen worse. What caught his attention was the symbol carved into the victim's flesh, a reaper's hand. The sheriff knew that this was no ordinary murder. It was clear that the killer was sending a message, but what was it? Who was the intended recipient? These were the questions that ran through the sheriff's mind as he began his investigation. He started by canvassing the area, asking residents if they had seen or heard anything suspicious. But everyone he spoke to seemed just as clueless as he was. It was as if the killer had vanished into thin air. Frustrated and feeling the weight of the town's expectations on his shoulders, the sheriff decided to dig deeper. He pored over the victim's personal life, looking for any clues that might lead him to the killer. But there was nothing out of the ordinary, no enemies, no grudges, no motive. It was then that the sheriff began to suspect that there was something more at play. He had heard stories of the town's dark past, of secrets and lies that had been buried for decades. Could the killer be seeking revenge on those who wronged them? It was a long shot, but the sheriff knew that he had to consider every possibility. As the day wore on and the investigation dragged on, the sheriff couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something. He knew that the clock was ticking, and that the killer was out there somewhere, waiting to strike again. But he refused to give up. He was determined to catch the Reaper's hand, no matter what it took. Chapter 3: The Second Victim. The sheriff arrived at the scene of the second murder, the stench of death overpowering. The victim lay sprawled out on the ground, the Reaper's hand symbol carved into their flesh. The sheriff knew then that he was dealing with something beyond human understanding. He combed the area for any clues, but found none. It was as if the killer had vanished into thin air. The sheriff couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something important, something that was right in front of him. He returned home, hoping to find some solace in his solitude. But the silence only served to amplify the whispers that had been haunting him since the first murder. He poured himself a glass of whiskey, hoping to drown out the voices in his head. But the whispers grew louder, the cold fingers of the vengeful spirit brushing against the back of his neck. The sheriff knew then that he was dealing with something far beyond his understanding. He sat in his chair, the glass of whiskey shaking in his hand. He knew that the Reaper's hand was not just a symbol, but a warning that he was in the presence of something far more dangerous than he had ever encountered before. The sheriff realized that he needed to delve deeper into the town's dark past if he was to have any hope of stopping the killer. But with each step he took, the whispers grew louder, the presence of the vengeful spirit more palpable. As the night wore on, the sheriff began to question his own sanity. Was he really seeing and hearing what he thought he was, or was it all in his head? And could he stop the killer before it claimed any more lives, or would he become the next victim of the Reaper's hand? Chapter 4: The Town's Dark Past. The sheriff had always suspected that there was something sinister lurking in the shadows of this small town, and as he delved deeper into its history, he found that his suspicions were not unfounded. The town's dark past was littered with secrets and lies that had been buried for decades, but now the Reaper's hand had brought them to the surface. As he sifted through old police reports and interviewed local residents, the sheriff began to piece together a disturbing pattern. Each victim of the Reaper's hand had a connection to a specific group of people who had been hiding a dark secret for years. The more the sheriff dug, the more he realized that this secret was tied to the town's founding. He learned of a group of settlers who had come to the area in the early 1800s and how they had been involved in a violent conflict with the local Native American tribe. The settlers had emerged victorious, but at a terrible cost. As the years passed, the descendants of those settlers had tried to keep their ancestors' violent past buried. But now, with the Reaper's hand haunting the town, the sheriff knew that the truth had to be uncovered. He spent long hours poring over old documents and newspaper articles, piecing together the events of that violent conflict. He discovered that the settlers had been led by a man named John Blackwood, who had been consumed with hatred and rage towards the Native Americans. The sheriff began to suspect that the Reaper's hand was the manifestation of that hatred and rage, seeking revenge on the descendants of those settlers who had tried to bury the past. He knew that he had to find a way to stop the Reaper's hand before it claimed any more lives. As he closed his notebook and headed home for the night, the sheriff couldn't shake the feeling that he was getting too close to the truth. He wondered if the killer was watching him, waiting for the right moment to strike. But he refused to back down. He knew that he had to see this through to the end, no matter what the cost. Chapter 5: The Reaper Strikes Again. The sheriff's heart sank as he received the call. Another victim had been found, and this time it was someone he knew. It was one of the people he had been keeping a close eye on, one of the people he believed was part of the group the killer was targeting. He arrived at the scene to find the victim, a middle-aged man, lying face down in a pool of his own blood. The Reaper's hand was carved into his back, just like the previous victims. The sheriff could feel his anger and frustration building up inside him. How many more people had to die before he could catch this killer? He immediately called in his team and started questioning the victim's family and friends. He was determined to find a clue, any clue, that would lead him to the killer. But the killer seemed to have vanished without a trace. Days turned into weeks, and the town was on edge. No one felt safe anymore, and everyone was looking over their shoulders. The sheriff was working around the clock, following every lead, but the killer was always one step ahead. As the sheriff dug deeper into the town's history, he uncovered more secrets and lies. He discovered that the group of people he had been watching was not the only one with a dark secret. The town was full of them. He realized that the killer was not just seeking revenge on one group, but on the entire town. With this realization, the sheriff's investigation took a different turn. He started looking into the town's past and the events that had led to the killer's awakening. He discovered a long-forgotten tragedy, one that had been covered up by the town's most powerful people. The tragedy had left a scar on the town, one that the killer was seeking to avenge. The sheriff knew he was getting closer to the truth, but he also knew that time was running out. The killer had become bolder, and the sheriff feared that the killer would strike again, and this time it could be someone he cared about. As he sat in his office, going over his notes, he heard a sound. It was a sound he had heard before, the sound of a reaper's scythe being sharpened. He knew that the killer was getting ready to strike again, and he had to act fast. The sheriff grabbed his gun and headed out into the night, determined to catch the killer once and for all. But as he walked through the deserted streets, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The killer was out there, and he was ready to strike. Chapter 6: The Sheriff's Sanity is Tested. The sheriff had always prided himself on his level-headedness, but the events of the past few days had begun to take their toll. He couldn't shake the feeling that the killer he was pursuing wasn't human, that it was some sort of malevolent spirit that had been awoken by the town's dark secrets. And as he delved deeper into the town's history, he couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching him, following him. One night, as he sat in his office poring over old case files, he heard a strange scratching sound at the door. He got up to investigate, but found nothing there. As he turned back to his desk, he saw movement out of the corner of his eye. When he looked up, he saw a shadowy figure standing in the corner of the room, watching him. He tried to rationalize it. He was tired, stressed, overworked. But the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. It followed him everywhere he went, like a dark cloud hanging over his head. One afternoon, as he was driving down the deserted highway that led out of town, he saw a figure standing in the middle of the road. He slammed on the brakes, but when he looked back, there was no one there. He rubbed his eyes, wondering if he was losing his mind. That night, he dreamed of the Reaper's hand, the symbol carved into the flesh of each victim. In his dream, he saw the killer's face, a twisted, malevolent thing that seemed to be made of shadows and smoke. When he woke up, he was covered in sweat, his heart racing. The sheriff knew that he couldn't keep going like this. He was on the brink of a breakdown. But he also knew that he couldn't stop now. He had to catch the killer, no matter what the cost. And so he steeled himself, pushed aside his doubts and fears, and set out to confront the Reaper's hand once and for all. Chapter 7: The Final Confrontation. The sheriff's heart was pounding in his chest as he approached the abandoned house where the killer was said to be hiding. He could feel his palms growing damp with sweat as he pulled his gun from his holster and slowly pushed open the creaky front door. The musty scent of decay assaulted his nostrils, causing him to gag slightly as he took in the dark, shadowy interior. He knew that the killer was somewhere inside, waiting for him. As he moved cautiously through the house, his eyes darting from shadow to shadow, he heard a faint rustling sound coming from somewhere ahead. He raised his gun, his finger tightening on the trigger as he crept closer and closer. Suddenly, a figure leapt out from the shadows, its face twisted into a grotesque mask of rage and hatred. The sheriff recognized the face of the killer and his blood ran cold. Without hesitation, he opened fire, the sound of his gunshots echoing through the empty house. The killer was quick, dodging and weaving like a ghost, but the sheriff was determined not to let him get away. Their dance of death continued for what felt like an eternity, each man trying to gain the upper hand. But in the end, it was the sheriff who emerged victorious. With one final, deadly shot, he brought the killer down. As he stood there, panting and sweating, the sheriff knew that the town would finally be at peace. He had faced down the Reaper's hand and emerged victorious. But even as he thought this, he couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't quite right. Was it possible that the killer wasn't working alone? Was there another, even more dangerous force at work in the town? The sheriff knew that he couldn't rest until he had found out the truth. But for now, he was content to bask in the knowledge that he had done his duty and saved countless lives in the process. Thank you for watching Midnight Murmurs. I hope you enjoyed this spooky tale of revenge and secrets in a small town. If you want to hear more stories like this, don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel. We release new chilling content every week, so hit that notification bell to stay up to date. Until next time, sweet dreams, if you can sleep at all.